In March of 2021, across the city of Dakar, hundreds of thousands of people opened the same app at the same time to do the same small thing: buy a little phone credit, top up their airtime. And the app said no. The airtime they were trying to buy belonged to Orange, the largest telecom in Senegal. And Orange had just decided to stop selling it through the app they were using. The app was called Wave. It was barely 2 years old, and the most powerful telecom in Francophone Africa had just declared war on it. Now, on paper, this was a fight Wave should have lost. Orange owned the network. Orange owned the towers. Orange owned the airtime. Wave owned nothing but an app and a promise. The promise was a single number: 1%. Where everyone else charged 5, 8, 10% to move your money, Wave charged 1. And putting cash in, taking cash out, the thing every other company on the continent made its money on, Wave gave away for free. So, the telecom tried to strangle it. It did not work. 6 months after the airtime went dark, this 2-year-old fintech, run by 2 Americans out of an office in Dakar, became the first unicorn in the history of Francophone Africa, worth $1.7 billion. And one of the people who wrote a check was the man who runs OpenAI. This is the story of Wave, the app that beat a telecom at its own game by charging almost nothing. This is Asili Africa. Hi again. Welcome back to the pod. My name is Farouk, and today we are going deep into the story of Wave, the story of 2 American roommates from Brown University who built a money app in Senegal that did the one thing every mobile money company on the continent said was impossible. It made putting cash in and taking cash out completely free, charged a flat 1% on everything else, undercut the largest telecom in Francophone Africa by 80%. And when that telecom tried to juke them out by cutting off their airtime, they took it to the regulator. 1. Became the region's first unicorn and got a check from the man who runs OpenAI. Let's get into it. The story begins in a dormitory at Brown University in the autumn of 2004. 2 freshmen, hallmates, end up friends. One is Drew Durbin. The other is Lincoln Quirk. They both graduate in 2008. Quirk studies computer science. Durbin, by his own telling, had written down a goal back in a 9th grade ethics class: to build a product that helped 1 million people. After Brown, Durbin moves to Tanzania. He starts a social enterprise making handcarts out of recycled materials. It does not scale. He starts a second one making solar cookers. That one does not scale either. 2 failures, back to back, in the same hard market. But somewhere in those failures, Durbin lands on a conclusion that will define the rest of his life. The thing holding everything back, he decides, is not carts or cookers, it is the cost of moving money. In his words, money is in constant motion, and if you can help people move it more efficiently and more cheaply, you change everything. So in 2014, Durbin and Quirk build a company around exactly that. They call it SendWave. It is a smartphone app for people in the diaspora sending money home to Africa. At the time, Western Union and MoneyGram took around 7% of every transfer. SendWave did it for about 3, almost instantly. It worked fast. Within 6 months of launch, SendWave was the single largest remitter of money from the United States to Kenya. From there, it spread across corridor after corridor. And in August of 2020, the British company World Remit agreed to buy SendWave in a deal worth more than $500 million in cash and stock. 2 roommates from Brown had built a company and sold it for $500 million. That exit is the financial spine of everything that comes next. It gave the founders capital. It gave them credibility with the biggest venture firms in America. And it gave them a pattern that worked: cheap, mobile-first money movement aimed at African corridors. But it also left Durbin staring at a problem he had not solved. SendWave had made the cross-border part cheap. Sending the money was now easy. The problem was what happened when the money landed. A family in Senegal might pay 3% to receive a transfer and then pay another 5, 8, even 10% to a company like Orange Money just to pull that cash out of the wallet on their phone. The expensive part was not the long journey across the ocean. The expensive part was the last few feet, the walk from the phone to the cash. Durban had a name for it. The terminal leg, the final leg of the money's journey, controlled by the mobile money operators who owned the agent networks. Orange in Senegal, Safaricom in Kenya, MTN across much of the rest. They controlled the cash out, so they took most of the value. Sendwave had attacked the cross-border leg. The next company would attack the terminal leg. It would go after the most expensive few feet in African finance. And it would do it in Senegal. Even while Sendwave was still running, Durban started a second project, a side experiment at first, a mobile money app of its own, built for Senegal. They called it Wave. It piloted in 2016. It went live commercially in 2018, with Durban stepping in as full-time chief executive on the first day of January that year. And it launched with a price list that, to everyone already in the industry, looked like a mistake. Putting cash into your Wave account, free. Taking cash out, free. Sending money to another Wave user, free. And for everything else, transfers across networks, a single flat fee, 1%. Remember, the incumbent, Orange Money, was charging somewhere between 5 and 10% on a typical transaction. Wave was undercutting the most powerful company in Senegalese finance by as much as 80%. And the part that mattered most, cash in and cash out, the deposits and the withdrawals. That was the exact line of business that every mobile money operator on the continent lived on. Wave just gave it away. This was not generosity. It was the Amazon playbook, and the founders said so openly. Lose money on the thing that brings people in. Make it back on volume, and on everything you can sell them later. Wave's own chief technology officer, Ben Koen, would later estimate that the company was saving Senegalese users around $200 million a year. About 1% of the entire economic output of Senegal. To pull it off, Wave built differently. No bank branches. Instead, an army of agents at corner kiosks. Koen liked to point out that the biggest banks in Senegal had around 40 branches each, while Wave had more than 100 times as many agents. And while the incumbents made you fight through clunky phone menus that charged you for every session, Wave was a clean app, with free cards, carrying a simple printed code for anyone whose phone was too basic to run it. The other thing Wave did was hire Koura Karine Sen. Sen was Senegalese, French-trained, an engineer who had spent more than a decade as a project manager in the French insurance industry before deciding to come home to Dakar in 2012, specifically to work on digitizing Africa. She joined Wave in 2018 to run business development in Senegal. In time, she would become the single most quoted executive at the company, the public face of the whole story, which mattered, quietly, because the two founders were not African, and Wave was building African infrastructure. Sen was the answer to a question the company knew people would eventually ask, and it grew. Quietly at first, then not quietly at all. By June of 2020, Wave had crossed 1 million users. That is when Orange stopped being polite. Because at 1% with free withdrawals, Wave was not just competing with Orange Money. It was making Orange Money's entire business model impossible to defend. So in March of 2021, Sonatel, the company that runs Orange in Senegal, cut Wave off. It blocked Wave from selling Orange airtime through the app. Wave could still sell airtime for the other networks, just not Orange's. The largest telecom in the country had decided to choke the upstart on the one product it controlled. The war was on. And down at the bottom of it, the people who felt it first were the agents. One Dakar agent, Ousmane Fall, watched his daily earnings get cut by more than half as the price war ground commissions down. In Côte d'Ivoire, agents went on strike. The fight at the top was reaching all the way down to the corner of the street. Wave did not retreat. It expanded. In April of 2021, Wave launched in Côte d'Ivoire, the second giant economy of Francophone West Africa. Within 2 months, Orange's market share there had fallen by 8.7%. Wave was not just surviving the war. It was opening a second front. Then, on the 7th of September 2021, came the moment that changed everything. Wave closed a Series A funding round of $200 million at a valuation of $1.7 billion. It was, at the time, the largest Series A in the history of African startups. The investors were a who's who of global venture capital: Sequoia Heritage, Founders Fund, Stripe, Ribbit Capital, with Patek and the chief executive of OpenAI, Sam Altman, writing checks alongside. With that round, Wave became the first unicorn in the history of Francophone Africa. Think about what that meant. A region that the global venture world had spent decades ignoring, written off as too small, too French, too hard, had just produced a billion-dollar technology company. And it had done it not by partnering with the telecom giant, but by attacking it. The validation kept coming. In April of 2022, the Central Bank of the West African Monetary Union, the BCEAO, granted Wave an electronic money license. Wave was the first company that was neither a bank nor a telecom, ever, to hold one. It no longer needed to hide behind a partner bank. It was now, in the eyes of the regulator, real financial infrastructure. But the cleanest victory was still the airtime war. Back in June of 2021, Koura Sen's team had filed a formal complaint against Sonatel with the ARTP, Senegal's telecoms regulator. They argued the block was anti-competitive, a violation of the country's electronic communications code. The fight played out, in public, in the pages of Jeune Afrique and the Africa Report, for more than a year. Orange executives called Wave predatory. One compared it directly to Amazon, said it was burning cash to kill the competition. Wave never really denied it. And on the 13th of November 2022, the regulator ruled. The ARTP forced Sonatel to restore Wave's access and to apply, without exception, the principles of equal treatment and non-discrimination. Orange had to let Wave sell its airtime on the same terms it gave its own subsidiaries. A Francophone African regulator had ruled against the most powerful telecom in the country in favor of a 2-year-old fintech. The cost moat that Orange had relied on for years turned out to be something the law would not protect. Wave had won the war, and almost immediately it discovered that winning Senegal was not the same as winning Africa. The growth was real and fast. By 2022, Wave was pushing into Mali, Burkina Faso, and the Gambia, then Sierra Leone, building an agent network that would eventually pass 150,000 people. It launched in Uganda in late 2021, its first English-speaking market. And that is where the story turns. In June of 2022, the global venture winter arrived. Money got expensive. Investors everywhere pulled back. And Wave, which had been expanding hard on the assumption that capital would keep flowing, had to cut. It laid off around 300 people, about 15% of its staff. The cuts fell hardest on the newest markets: Uganda, Mali, Burkina Faso. The company said plainly that it was scaling back so it would not have to depend on raising new money in a market where investors were running scared. Leadership called it one of the hardest decisions the business had ever made. To steady the core, the development finance world stepped in. In July of 2022, the International Finance Corporation, the IFC, led a €90 million debt facility with a syndicate of European development funds alongside. Wave was no longer just a venture story. It was now an impact and development finance story too. But Uganda was the deeper lesson. In Senegal, Wave had beaten Orange because Orange's prices were soft and its agent network was thin. In Uganda, the incumbents were different animals. MTN and Airtel together controlled more than 95% of the market, and they had built deep agent networks first, exactly the way Safaricom had, with M-Pesa in Kenya. Wave's price weapon, the one that shattered Orange, barely scratched them. Filings would later show Wave's Ugandan losses widening year after year. A second round of cuts reportedly took the local team from around 180 people down to roughly 25. The pattern was becoming clear. Wave was dominant in Francophone West Africa, subscale in Central Africa, and structurally stuck in the East. The playbook that broke Orange didn't break the M-Pesa-style incumbents who had gotten there first. And then the incumbents started copying Wave. By 2024, MTN had gone free on withdrawals in Côte d'Ivoire. Orange in Cameroon had cut peer-to-peer transfers to zero. Orange itself, in Senegal, had already slashed its blended fees by around 80% to compete. A withdrawal of 5,000 francs that once cost 350 francs now cost 25. The very price moat Wave had built, the 1% wall, was being torn down by the giants it had embarrassed. The hardest blow came on the 30th of September, 2025. The BCEAO, the same central bank that had legitimized Wave in 2022, launched a new instant payment network for the whole West African Monetary Union. The launch list named 31 approved entities. Wave was not on it. Neither was MTN. The regulator that had once protected Wave was now building the future rails of West African money, and leaving Wave on the outside, pending paperwork the company had not yet finished. The disruptor had a sudden, uncomfortable taste of what it felt like to be on the wrong side of the gatekeeper. So Wave did the only thing that could outrun a copied price. It decided to stop being a payments app and become a bank. On the 4th of August 2025, Wave incorporated a new company in Abidjan, Wave Bank Africa SA, a fully licensed commercial bank, capitalized at 20 billion CFA francs, around $32 million. Its chair was Koura Sen. The logic was simple and profound. A payments license let Wave move money. A banking license would let it hold deposits, pay interest, and above all, lend. The next moat would not be price. It would be the balance sheet. To fund the push, in June of 2025, Wave raised another $137 million in debt, this time led by Rand Merchant Bank, with British International Investment, FinFund, and Norfund alongside. Total disclosed funding now sat north of $430 million. Then, the products started arriving. On the 9th of February, 2026, Wave, Visa, and Ecobank Senegal launched a virtual Visa card inside the app, giving millions of West Africans, for the first time, an easy way to buy from the global internet. And the company moved deeper into the state itself, signing a partnership to digitize payments across Senegal's public hospitals, with the health minister calling electronic payment a sustainable standard for the country's healthcare. Where does that leave Wave in the middle of 2026? 20 million monthly users, 150,000 agents, 3,000 employees across 8 countries. In Senegal alone, around 11 million users, close to 90% of the adult population. Wave is no longer a startup. It is the default way an entire country moves money. But the question is no longer whether Wave can take customers from Orange. It already did. The question is whether a company built to give away the one thing banks charge for can now become the bank. Whether it can turn 20 million wallets into 20 million bank accounts before the incumbents finish copying everything that made it special. That is the bet. And it is being placed by 2 founders who are not African, who came out of an effective altruism reading group at Brown 2 decades ago, and who are now trying to build something durable enough to outlast the price war they started. The story of Wave is the story of a simple, almost stubborn idea that the cost of moving money in Africa was a bug, not a fact of life, that the most expensive few feet in African finance could be made free. 2 roommates believed it, a Senegalese engineer carried it, a regulator upheld it, and a telecom giant was forced in the end to cut its own prices by 80% to survive it. Now Wave has to prove the second act is possible, that the app that beat the bank can become the bank. This is a silly Africa. Every empire has an origin. That is the story. And like every story worth telling, this one is still being written. If this episode made you see something differently, share it with someone who needs to hear it. I am Farouk. This is Asili Africa. Every empire has an origin. Now you know this one. So start building, because yours might be tomorrow's origin story. See you on the next one.